These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. We're talking the cost of living today as the national insurance rise comes in. And levelling up. Remember that? Well, more apprenticeships are needed, a new report says. And to frack or not to frack. Well, plus, we'll be discussing no-fault divorce with a top lawyer and the Conservative Party's LGBT row.
Good afternoon, it is 12 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. The Ukrainian president has told the Irish Parliament Russia is using hunger as a weapon and is deliberately creating a food crisis. Volodymyr Zelensky is calling for more rigid sanctions from EU leaders, saying they need to prioritise civilian losses over financial impacts. The chairman of EU leaders, Charles Michel, says European Union, the EU, would have to introduce a ban on Russian oil and gas imports sooner or later. President Zelensky says he can't tolerate any indecisiveness from the West on sanctions.
I'd like to ask you to convince EU partners to introduce even more rigid sanctions against Russia that would really make sure that the Russian war machine will stop. The only thing is that we're lacking is the principal approach of some leaders, political leaders, business leaders, who still think that war and war crimes is not something as horrific as financial losses.
Ukrainian authorities in the eastern region of Luhansk hope to evacuate civilians through 5 humanitarian corridors today. They're urging residents to get out while it's safe due to concerns that Russian troops are preparing for a new offensive in the Donbass area. Well, latest British intelligence reveals heavy fighting and Russian airstrikes have continued in the encircled city of Mariupol. Most of the 160,000 remaining residents have no light, communication, medicine, heat or water as Russian forces have blocked humanitarian access. Well, the pressure caused by the war in Ukraine, in addition to labour shortages in food and farming, that could see food prices rise here in the UK. One government report said, as of August last year, there were potentially in excess of 500,000 job vacancies affecting food security, animal welfare and the mental health of staff. The planned 1.25% rise in national insurance comes into force from today, impacting the income of millions of households. Well, the rise means Britain's tax burden has now risen to its highest point in 70 years. The government says £39 billion will be raised over the next 3 years, helping to reduce the NHS backlog. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, told GBNews the support the government provided over the pandemic, borrowing £400 billion, is money that's got to be paid back.
Economically, it is not sensible just to continue borrowing and borrowing. We're still running a deficit, so if it wasn't the levy, it would mean more borrowing. I mean, of course, the alternative way is if we didn't tax and went for that borrowing, it's also morally wrong as well, because it would mean that we would be asking our children and our grandchildren to pay for our health care and our care costs in old age. I mean, how can that possibly be right?
Coronavirus case rates in England are the highest they've ever been. Well, researchers from Imperial College London say a rising prevalence in older adults having the infection may increase hospitalisations and deaths, despite high levels of vaccination. The two variants of Omicron have caused twin peaks in the pandemic this year, one in January, another in March. Married couples in England and Wales are now able to legally break up without having to attribute blame for the breakdown of their marriage. In the biggest overhaul of the law in half a century, no-fault divorce legislation comes into force today. Campaigners say that for families who want to break up amicably, it will help them move forward without conflict. Well, Georgina Chase, the head of family law at Slater & Gordon, told us that for many couples, it's the end of the blame game.
I understand that for many people, they will see that this means that getting divorced is easier. But I think it's not necessarily easier because the law in relation to how to sort the finances and children hasn't changed. What it means is that it's taking that sting out. It's making it more accessible. Otherwise, if they've not been separated for 2 years or more, they're having to rely on the fault-based fact of unreasonable behaviour, which, of course, unnecessarily creates tension and increases hostility.
Ed Sheeran has called for the end of baseless claims against songwriters. Today, he won a High Court battle in the copyright case against his song, Shape of You. Posting on social media after the verdict, the singer said claims like this are too common and they're damaging to the songwriting industry. Sheeran and his Shape of You co-writers denied copying parts of the 2015 song Oh Why by Sammy Chokri after Chokri claimed the tracks are strikingly similar. The University of Bristol has created a new 3D printed fingertip with a sense of touch like human skin. Researchers used a mesh of tiny pin-like bumps, like those found on human fingers, to produce it. Well, they found it was able to produce artificial nerve signals detecting pressure and the shape of contact, giving hope to researchers improving future prosthetics. You're up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's go back to the lunchtime briefing.
Coming up this hour on The Briefing, as prices soar, taxes are going up too. The national insurance hike earmarked for the NHS and social care comes into effect today. I'll be asking Labour MP Peter Dowd and our very own economics editor Liam Halligan what this means for the pound in your pocket. And as the government says, it will level up the country, but part of that is education, and a new report says that the drop in apprenticeships for school leavers is doing the exact opposite, hurting working-class kids in the north the most. Also, the energy security strategy comes out tomorrow at long last, and will it include fracking? Could fracking play a part? I'll ask the Conservative MP Craig McKinley. And no-fault divorce is here. I'll be asking a top family lawyer what that means. What do you think? Well, email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. Well, first in the programme today, prices are soaring, and from today you'll pay more national insurance too. It's part of the government's plan to raise money for health and social care to help the system recover from the pandemic. Employees, businesses and the self-employed will pay an extra 1.25p in the pound. That is what the Health Secretary Sajid Javid told us at GB News this morning.
All benefit from the levy, the increased funding and the services that will provide. We will all benefit from that. But in terms of paying for this, it does actually fall on the broadest shoulders. The 15% highest earners will pay over half the levy. And because of the national insurance tax cut that the Chancellor announced a couple of weeks ago, 70% of workers will be paying less national insurance, including taking account of this levy.
Now, many MPs have criticised the measure, saying that it's not the right time to introduce these tax rises, as it makes the cost of living crisis even worse. Well, joining me to talk about this is Peter Dowd, the Labour MP for Bootle and former Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Welcome to the programme, Peter. Thanks so much for joining us. First of all, I suppose it's a bit curious to hear the Labour Party, a party traditionally known for wanting a larger state, more spending and potentially, yes, higher taxes, criticise a tax move. Have both these parties sort of changed clothes?
Well, I think that's a characterisation which it really isn't in fact true. what the Labour Party want is a high growth economy. And in the past 12 years, we've had a low growth economy. And by a high growth economy, you get a bigger portion, a bigger tax base if you want. So on that, people tend to pay less tax because of a higher economic growth. We've had 12 years of austerity, which hasn't helped. There's been lack of investment in the public and the private sector. That feeds into the broad general, if you want, the macroeconomic situation. So it isn't just about now, it's how we got here in the first place. And just one other point, remember, we bailed out the banks to the tune of £1.3 trillion in one fashion or another, with loans, guarantees. A significant part of NatWest is still in public ownership. So if we can do it in that situation, we can. The worst health crisis that anybody can remember has cost £400 billion. It's going to last for years, and the government have got to have a plan, not just the next year or 2 years, to get it out of that situation, overlaid with the cost of living crisis as well.
So your solution to this particular problem of funding catch-up NHS care, of funding social care, in the short term would be to increase borrowing in the hope that there'd be more growth and then the tax receipts would rise naturally without the need for tax rises in the medium to long term?
Well, I mean, it's part of it, but I think it's got to be part of a solution that this fixation that the £400 billion that we've, in a sense, spent on COVID is, it's got to come to an end immediately. The sooner we get rid of it, the quicker. Well, our lesson from austerity from 2010 to now is that you don't rush into those sorts of things because it is counterproductive. So it isn't simply a question of saying, let's just borrow more. It's a question of having a plan over a longer period of time to withdraw from that. Now, what we found with the government, it's virtually missed all its fiscal targets. It's virtually missed every time it says we want to get borrowing down. It never hit the targets. I can't remember how many George Osborne had. I can't remember how many Philip Hammond had. Rishi Sunak's most probably the same. It's not about the immediacy of trying to sort this problem out. It's having a medium and long-term plan which includes economic growth within the economy more broadly. And as I said, investment in the economy. That's how we're going to solve this problem, not these quick fixes.
I suppose what the Conservative Party would say to that is that by 2015, the UK was the fastest growing economy in the G7. By 2019, the debt was falling as a proportion of GDP. The current budget, not investment, but the current budget was in surplus. And of course, since then, there's been a pandemic that has really rather knocked everything out of kilter. What would your response to that be?
Well, that's all the more reason why you have to have a sort of a plan which is both short, medium and long term. The bottom line is, over that period of 12 years, I accept that we had fits and starts in terms of growth, but we're now dipping back down. And I don't want to take 1 year or 2 year. I want to take a 10, 15, 20-year approach to the economy. And unfortunately, the government don't take that approach to the economy, whether it's in its investment, the public investment, or investment in public services. It doesn't take that approach. And another thing I think I might have mentioned in the past, we've got best part of £400 billion worth of tax reliefs, which are just there. And there needs to be a proper review of them, because many of those tax reliefs, like the entrepreneurs' tax relief, according to the IFS, the Resolution Foundation, are pretty much wasted. So you've got this huge sum of money, maybe £2 billion, going to a fairly limited number of people without any significant impact on the economy. They're the sort of things in that medium to long term that you've got to resolve as well.
What do you make of what the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, was telling us earlier today, that the lowest paid 70% of workers in the UK will actually from today be paying less national insurance than they did last year. And it's only the top 30% of those earners who are going to be paying more, who are going to be affected by this levy, thanks to the threshold rise.
Well, the bottom line is, overall, they're still going to be paying more. Let's take someone in the NHS, on average £27,000 a year income in the NHS. They're going to be paying £177 extra a year. That's actually an 8% increase in their payments. That's going to take best part of 1.2 million people in the NHS. That's going to take best part of 150, maybe £200 million out of their pockets. And the NHS itself is then going to have to pay its share of the national insurance contribution hike, which is going to be another 150 million. So all that money taken out of either the NHS or the pockets of NHS workers, and that goes right across the country. And it's not a good position to be in. After all, the government did promise they weren't going to put VAT up and national insurance or income tax. And lo and behold, what have they done? Well, the facts speak for themselves.
We are in a remarkable situation whereby the right-wing backbench Tory rebels are in complete agreement with you, Peter Dowd, Labour MP for Bootle and former Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. It's a remarkable coalition of the Labour Party and some rebellious Conservatives, although, of course, it's a coalition that failed. The Conservatives have raised that tax, and that starts today. Peter Dowd, thank you so much for talking us through those issues there. Let's turn now to our economics editor, Liam Halligan, to talk through the real-world impact of this. Because what Sajid Javid said this morning is true. The bottom 70% will pay less national insurance, but they'll probably pay more tax because of those threshold freezes on income tax as well. It's a complicated picture.
It is a complicated picture, Tom, and with the best will in the world, sometimes you think it's like one of the arts of government is making it as complicated as it can possibly be. So people like me and you have to detangle it all on television and everybody loses their mind. I think one thing that's worth pointing out that isn't quite punching through in the interviews and coverage I've seen so far is, yes, on this NIC rise, which comes into today, as you rightly say, it's a 1.25 percentage point increase in employees, workers, NICs. It goes up for employers too. So workers are now paying 13.25% of their income on national insurance, which is tax, right? It's just taxed by another name. So that's going up. At the same time, the rabbit that Rishi Sunak pulled out of his hat in his spring statement was that the threshold where you start paying NIC also goes up by about £2,500 to just under £13,000. So that's more generous because more of your income is not covered by that NIC. But hold on, because this is the key point.
Yes.
The tax rate increases now. The threshold only increases in July. Right? So you've got 3 months when everyone's paying more NIC if they work. Pensions don't pay NIC. People who aren't working don't pay NIC. So everyone's paying more NIC above the threshold, albeit a higher threshold. But it's above the old threshold. The new threshold, which is the bit that allows Sajid Javid to say 70% of people will pay less, doesn't come in until July. So if you listen really closely to what ministers are saying, they're kind of slightly canny with the tenses that they use. They will lead. Yes. Not now, but it will.
That's fascinating.
And this is the sort of thing that journalists like us, I know you're a really analytical guy as well, we have to tell our viewers and listeners this is what's really going on. There is a swizz in this. The threshold goes up a lot later than the tax rate goes up.
So for 3 months, people of many people on very low incomes will see much more
bang on the money.
Incomes.
You are on the money.
Well, we'll look forward to on the money from one. But this will be interesting politically because, of course, there are local elections coming up at the start of next month. People will have had their first tax hike pay slips by then. That's going to be a significantly more taxed pay slip for most low earners than it will be 3 months from now. Where does the politics play into this?
So when we did the Spring Statement special on GBNews, Gloria and I were presenting, you and Darren were doing a great job down at Westminster. We started to tease this out, didn't we? Almost immediately, we said he's going to have to do more in the summer. He's just going to have to do more in the summer because he hasn't done enough for poorer people. It's not only that benefits were frozen at 3.1% when inflation is 7 or 8%, the official prediction for this year. It's not only that, it's also that this NIC rise kicks in big time now before the threshold goes up in 3 months' time to slightly offset that increase for those lower income workers. These aren't the poorest, these are people in work. And they're being biffed with this much higher tax bill as their fuel bills are going up as well. And I think, and I've said this before, I think Rishi Sunak has seriously failed to grasp the extent of this cost of living triple whammy that is being imposed. It's not his fault. He's right to say, Sajid Javid is right to say, look, this is a global thing. You know, the British economy...
The rate of inflation is higher in the United States, the same in the European Union.
The British economy is being managed reasonably well. It's a long conversation, but it's not like they're particularly incompetent. Where I think they've been politically tin-eared is to go through with that national insurance rate rise now just because Rishi Sunak wants to burnish his credentials as I'm in charge and I'm the Chancellor, only then to pull out a tax cut in a year's time.
Which was obviously decided late in the day, because that's why you have the 3-month delay, I suppose. It takes time to feed this into the system.
I really don't think it does. Look, I mean... It's not sort of people with visors and in white shirts and bits of crayon and cards. You know, this is a highly mechanised system. HMRC has its drawbacks, but there are very powerful computers at work.
Liam Halligan, is this you suggesting that the government might in some way be efficient? I'm amazed.
No, I'm not. What I'm saying is I'm pointing out its relative efficiency. It's efficient enough to impose a policy if it wants to now. It doesn't have to wait 3 months to increase this NIC threshold in order to make what the ministers have been saying actually true now. It will only be true in July. It's only after July, after these local elections, after this cost of living increase has really kicked in big time. I think there's going to be non-payment of bills by a lot of people, by the way.
I suppose the government is really going to sit tight and hope for a lot better weather over the next few months. That's basically all they have in their arsenal.
Yeah, weather... OK, of course, you use more energy on heating in the winter, obviously, but, you know, air conditioning takes up a lot of energy, and, petrol, you drive more in the summer, you know, petrol and diesel prices are going up. I mean... I don't want to sound too cynical, but it's almost as if the Treasury has laid a trap here. There's going to be I do think the Conservatives are going to feel a lot of political heat as and when people really, as Labour cotton on, not sure they have yet, to the fact that there's a mismatch between when the national insurance rate goes up and when the threshold goes up. It was barely mentioned in the Chancellor's speech. It's barely been written about. But it's going to be a big story.
Big story. Next 3 months particularly squeezing. Well, Liam Halligan, you'll be back at 1 p.m. for On the Money. We'll look forward to seeing these issues discussed in far more detail then.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining us now. Well, more on that national insurance contribution rise with fantastic guests, of course, from 1 p.m. But the government commissioned a new report into the impact of fracking yesterday. I'll be talking to Craig McKinley, chair of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, about that next. Don't go anywhere. Before that, a short break.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70 150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Welcome back. Now, the government talks a lot about levelling up. They even named a department after it. And part of that, of course, is improving education and access to apprenticeships. But the number of entry-level apprenticeships has more than halved since 2011. And according to a new report from the think tank Onward, a shortage of apprenticeships, especially in the north, is holding young people back and hindering that levelling up agenda. Well, Francesca Fraser is a senior researcher at Onward and co-authored that report. I'm delighted to say she joins me now. Welcome to the programme. I suppose, first of all, how on earth are we only just finding about this now? It seems like every single general elections, governments promise more and more apprenticeships and say they're going to do wonderful things. But if the number in practice has halved since 2011, how on earth has that happened?
Hi, Tom, and you're totally right. It's a real challenge for this government. We know that there's been quite a lot of reform to apprenticeships in the last 5 years or so, and a lot of this has been really positive. It's improved the quality of the training and left apprentices much more sort of competent when they enter the workplace as a result. But the risk is there's been unintended consequences to this. Apprenticeships can play such an important role in people's lives. They provide education, a route into employment, and particularly in technical trades. And like you say, there's a risk that this is changing as businesses turn their backs on the traditional apprenticeship. And this is hitting, as you say, red wall places, parts of the north, much heavier than parts of the south. And that's ultimately limiting education opportunities as well.
Has there been too much of a focus on university degrees? Many jobs now requiring a university degree for the sorts of things that you wouldn't have needed one for in decades gone by. Have we gone down an academic route far too much? And should we be thinking about lessening those academic hurdles in front of people and encouraging these routes more often?
So I think you're right. There's been a huge expansion of the amount of people going to university. And this is largely as a result of certain policies that have really pushed this. And that's not to say going to university is a bad thing. We have some of the best universities in the world in this country, and they're a huge asset to us. But the risk of the expansion has meant that there are a number of courses that people study that ultimately aren't necessarily giving them the returns, nor the taxpayer, who often ends up footing the bill because of the earnings premium that comes from it. So I think you're right. We need to be investing more in further education. The government's recognised this too, to their credit. But what we want to see is a greater push on apprenticeships that, as I've said, particularly in these sort of industrial heartlands, parts of the country where levelling up is designed to help, there isn't enough being done. They need to push that more.
And what should be done? Does this mean that the government needs to spend yet more money, give money to companies, in effect, bribe companies to take on apprentices? Or is there another way that we can incentivise this? Do we need a culture shift, perhaps? What is your recommendation?
So we are calling for two big things from government. The first is proper funding of 16 to 18-year-olds who are studying apprenticeships. Right now, if they choose to study an A-level, the taxpayer will fund them. If they do an apprenticeship, they won't. Or at least businesses are expected to take some of the cost. So that's the first thing, properly funding those. The second, and this is a much less costly option, is the reality that apprenticeships are really, really difficult to manage at the moment. There's a lot of complexity and bureaucracy around the system. And we wouldn't recommend removing that, because ultimately there's really important standards that need to be held. But we should be helping businesses to overcome some of those barriers. And we would recommend giving mayors much better powers to do this. They already work with their communities, with training providers for things like skills boot camps. They're well placed to do it. And we should be giving them the responsibility to link up employers with apprentices and training providers, and actually holding them accountable for doing that too.
Now, those metro mayors have been incredibly popular, and we've seen that in terms of turnouts. We've seen that in terms of the number of votes that they've got in places like Manchester, in places like the Tees Valley. It's been an incredibly successful reform. However, there are many parts of the country that don't have those mayors and those structures. Would this be creating an imbalance, potentially, delivering powers and funding to those combined authorities with those directly elected mayors versus the areas without?
So I don't think so. What we would really propose is the trailblazer deals that are being agreed with the West Midlands and Greater Manchester at the moment should be championing this, and we should work out what works and then roll it out further. But there are other things government can do that can help those local areas, those local businesses to hire apprentices, like funding younger apprentices better, also doing things like expanding front loading of apprenticeships. So right now, it can, if you do sort of construction or something like that, do much more training at the beginning of your apprenticeship. So you go into the workplace, you're really productive already, and it's really beneficial to employers. So there are smaller changes as well that the government could push that can help some of these smaller areas that don't necessarily have a big metro mayor, as you say, to push.
Well, Francesca Fraser, it's a fascinating area, and I think that many people feel that we have lost a sense of manufacturing in this country and that potentially apprentices is a way to rebuild that heritage. I'm afraid we've run out of time in this conversation, but thank you so much for joining us here and discussing that new report from your think tank, Onward. Now, tomorrow, the long-awaited energy security strategy will be published, or so we're told. It's been waiting quite a while. Could fracking be back on the menu? I'll talk to Craig McKinley, the Conservative MP and chair of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, next. But first, it's your news.
Good afternoon, I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. The Prime Minister says today's 1.25% rise in national insurance is unquestionably the right thing to do for our country and the NHS. Britain's tax burden, though, has now risen to its highest point in 70 years. The government says £39 billion will be raised over the next 3 years, helping to reduce the NHS backlog. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has told the Irish Parliament some political and business leaders think war crimes are not as horrific as financial losses. He's called for more rigid sanctions from the EU.
I'd like to ask you to convince EU partners to introduce even more rigid sanctions against Russia that would really make sure that the Russian war machine will stop. The only thing is that we're lacking is the principal approach of some leaders, political leaders, business leaders, who still think that war and war crimes is not something as horrific as financial losses.
Pope Francis has condemned what he's described as the massacre of Bucha. He was holding up a Ukrainian flag as he said it, and that had been sent to him from the town. Recent footage has shown images of tied bodies, mass graves and other signs of executions. The Prime Minister has defended the government's decision to not include trans people in the proposed ban on conversion therapy. Speaking during a hospital visit, Boris Johnson said there were complexities and sensitivities which needed to be worked through. Well, coronavirus case rates in England are the highest they've ever been. Experts from Imperial College London say a rising prevalence in older adults getting the infection may increase hospitalisations and deaths despite high levels of vaccination. Pop star and songwriter Ed Sheeran has called for the end of baseless claims against songwriters after winning a High Court battle in the copyright case of his song Shape of You. In a video he posted on social media, the singer said claims like this are too common and they're damaging to the songwriting industry. Sheeran and his Shape of You co-writers denied copying parts of the 2015 song Oh Why by Sammy Chokri after Chokri claimed the tracks were surprisingly similar. You're up to date on GB News. We're on your TV, online and radio. Shortly, we'll be back to Tom with the briefing.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Welcome back. Now, Pippa Bartolotti, the former leader of the Welsh Green Party, posted this on her Facebook account yesterday. Quote, "As friends know, I do not take the mainstream news reports at face value. The carnage is real enough, I'm sure, but without a shred of forensic evidence, blame has been duly apportioned." She was talking about the horrific crimes in Bucha, revealed as Russian troops withdrew from that town on the outskirts of Kiev. Remarkably, she's arguing that blame should not be apportioned to Russia, despite the testimony of those who survived those brutal attacks. She went on to write, "Unusually, the barbarism was shown on US early evening news when the children are still around, which I think is plain wrong no matter which way the blame falls." She continued to write, "Of course, it was all about manufacturing our consent to send even more lethal aid to Ukraine." End quote. As if it's a bad thing for the West to help the Ukrainian people defend themselves. And as if the West is manipulating this conflict. As if it's the West that wants this war. Now, attaching an article from the Kremlin propaganda website Russia Today, which claimed the Ukrainian narrative of the events in Bucha stretched credulity, she wrote, quote, "Russia asked the UN for an urgent meeting at the time. The request was denied." Her statement takes what is published in Russian state media at greater face value than what appears in free Western media. But this was not the first time that Pippa Bartolotti, an avid Green campaigner and someone who represented the Green Party in ITV's 2015 Welsh Leaders debate, has posted the Russian narrative on her social media profile. In a post on the 28th of March, Miss Bartolotti wrote that Zelensky, quote, "was not prepared to talk about denazification." She cited a Russian propaganda UN resolution that the West opposed and abstained on for reasons that should be obvious to any observer. That it would be bizarre to give credence to Putin's fantasies of fighting the supposed Nazism of the Ukrainian people as a whole. Those fantasies that the Kremlin seeks to justify Russia's indiscriminate murder of Ukrainian civilians. That's what the Kremlin is saying. An article in Russian state media, RIA Novosti, just this week argued that, quote, "substantial part of the population is also guilty of being passively Nazi." The Kremlin is clearly advancing the argument that the Ukrainian people, not just the Ukrainian army, is their enemy. But returning back to the former leader of the Wales Green Party and her questionable Facebook posts. On the 4th of March, she wrote, quote, "The Russian way is not what you might call full American, with relentless carpet bombing, thousands of troops all shooting and yelling and so on. The Russian way is to pursue negotiations and warfare at the same time, in the hope that warfare can be curtailed as soon as negotiations are concluded." She added that Russia Today has now been removed from Telegram. Pity her words. I have to stress this is a slim selection of the Kremlin-aligned talking points that have appeared on her public Facebook page. These are certainly eyebrow-raising comments from an individual who has been as senior as to represent her party in a television debate not so many years ago. Now, we reached out to the Green Party for comment this morning, asking if Bartoletti remains a member of the party. As of this moment, we've heard no response. Well, we'll bring you any response as and when we get it. But for now, let's turn to energy. The long-awaited energy security strategy is expected to be published tomorrow. The strategy comes after the need to find a way to improve Britain's domestic resilience following Russia's invasion of Ukraine has risen up the political agenda. Yesterday, the government decided to call a review to look into the impact of fracking. What is fracking? How does it work, and can it be a part of the government's new strategy? Well, joining me is Craig McKinley, Conservative MP and chair of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group. Welcome to the programme, Craig. I suppose, first of all, it's been a remarkably bumpy road for extracting British natural shale gas. America started to do it under the late Bush and early Obama administration, was incredibly successful. We then started to tentatively do it, but then started to ban it, and a moratorium came down in 2019. Since then, there have been a number of reviews, but nothing much has shifted. Has the political climate now changed to realise that potentially this is necessary?
I think two things have happened, Tom. Number one, obviously, the Ukraine war, and energy security is now front and centre of what the government is now thinking about, thankfully, finally. And also, I think the experience of the US and their experience of shale gas extraction, and let's thank them for what they did, because without that surplus of gas that they're producing through fracking, we would be in a really, truly dreadful state and perhaps looking at the lights going out, because it's their LNG gas that's now coming over the Atlantic, making up for shortages around the world on the back of COVID. But the energy security is now front and centre. The Prime Minister has said, yeah, we must now be looking at domestically produced hydrocarbons, because let's not forget, every one of those bombs raining down in Ukraine has been financed on the back of Europe's completely failed energy policy, particularly on gas. So, yeah, we're in a different place. I think there was always a case for shale gas, but we're now focusing on what is important, on affordability, on energy security, and actually a lower CO2 footprint, which comes from domestic supplied gas rather than importing it halfway around the world. I really would like to put on the table some Savanta Comres results that were done by Net Zero Watch, just came out this morning. And we're always told the public are against fracking. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if they were, given that all we've had is a diet of anti for many years. But the results are very, very different. And this is a proper Savanta Comres poll, and 44% of the general population are now in favour of fracking versus 36% against. For Conservatives, that goes up to 57% in favour with 28% against. And I think net zero is now coming to the fore, because people are realising that net zero doesn't come without massive cost. So people were asked, what has net zero done for energy security? 41% in that poll have said it has weakened our energy security. And then asked, what are the primary things that we should be pursuing for UK energy policy? A full 52% said affordability, 26% said national security, and trailing at the rear was only 16% said achieving net zero by 2050. And let's not forget, that is on a background of a diet of anti-fracking, anti-all this, with the environmental lobby have really been in control of our agenda for many years. Reality is now coming to bear. But I would say nobody needs to have shale gas in their backyard if they don't want it. We need to have a new formula where local communities are properly recompensed very generously if they want one of these things nearby. And I think that's a great idea. And you know what? I'd go one stage further. I would say any of the tax receipts that go to the National Treasury on the back of a new shale gas revolution, should it come, should be ring-fenced and spent entirely on energy saving and insulation measures, because the Treasury wasn't going to get a penny in the first place without shale gas. All of that tax revenue would be going to Qatar, the US, and heaven help us, Russia as well. So I think this could be a win-win all round in terms of investment, tax receipts, jobs, levelling up, and a big saving to our balance of payments problems that this country has always had a very big problem over.
It certainly does seem to be the case that people in times of prosperity worry more about potentially the environment, but at times of hardship do think back to the pound in their pocket and whether or not they can keep the lights turned on. I just wonder, though, on the practicalities of this. Obviously, people of this country are facing an incredibly difficult time over the next 12 months due to the global situation, yes, due to bad decisions made over the last decade and a half in this country and in Europe as well. But really, when we're talking about starting up, investing, getting this stuff set up, it's not going to help for next winter, is it?
No, this won't be immediate, but I've obviously been in contact with a number of the companies that could do shale gas extraction, not least Quadrilla. Thankfully, we managed to stop the concreting over of those wells just last week. But, given a fair wind and some help in getting the planning consents through, they are confident that they could get gas flowing within 14 months. But I always refer to, fun enough, Gandhi at these times. The longest journey starts with the first step. Unless we start with this, the end point is going to be further and further away. So I would recommend we get the science done. The British Geological Survey have been appointed by the government to actually look at this again, the science, which is really important. And depending on the outcome of that, perhaps we can get going with this new industry. But I would certainly hope, as part of that review, they'll be looking at the economics as well, and not just the science. If you remember where we've been through the COVID experience, I think we'd looked a little bit too much just at the science and not about the holistic approach on other health and economics as well. So yes, let's put the economics in this. But we do need domestic gas. Gas is going to be with us for a generation yet. Even the Climate Change Committee admit that gas is going to be part of our energy mix for a very long time. Why not source it domestically? Because you would actually have a massive CO2 saving as well, which at the end of the day, I thought this was what it was all about.
And I suppose that natural gas, of course, has a lower CO2 profile than both coal or oil. So there is a saving to be made there as well. I can't help but note this 3-month review does take us to the other side of the local elections. I hate to be cynical. I wonder how much that plays into the politics of all of this. I'm afraid we've run to the end of this conversation for now. But Craig McKinley, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing this afternoon. Now, around half of marriages sadly end in divorce. Up until yesterday, getting divorced has meant assigning blame or being separated for up to 5 years first. But from now, in England and Wales, no-fault divorce is possible, with the biggest change to divorce laws in 50 years. Well, to tell us more, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Jo Edwards, Chair of Resolution, which represents family justice professionals. Thank you so much for making it into the studio to talk through this. This is a significant change for England and Wales. Am I right in understanding it's been the case in Scotland for a little bit of time? How's it been working there?
So in Scotland, the law actually changed 16 years ago. They don't quite have what we've got today, but effectively they've had no-fault divorce for 16 years. What they did was shorten the periods of separation in Scotland. You talked about 5 years being what some couples had to wait for in England and Wales until yesterday. In Scotland, they can get divorced after 1 year of separation if both agree, or 2 years if only one person wants the divorce. So the effect of that in Scotland has been that 95% of their divorces are no fault. But here in England and Wales, it's a huge, monumental day for couples. We've waited 50 years for this change. The blame game is something which has brought so much acrimony, or more acrimony, into divorces than there needs to be. Resolution and other organisations are very welcoming of this change.
It does seem to be a pretty human thing to suggest that people should be able to control their own destiny, that there shouldn't be these arbitrary rules in who can enter or exit a contract. But on the other hand, people do argue that this might make the institution of marriage watered down. It might weaken the commitment between partners, and it may well increase the divorce rates. What's your response to that?
I understand the concern, but I can say very confidently that will not be what we will experience here, partly because I've been practicing for 25 years, and I see that when people make decisions to divorce, they do so after a long period of reflection. They typically go and have therapy. They think about it very carefully. They make the decision ignorant of what the law actually is. They don't come into my office and know exactly how it all operates. So whatever the divorce law looks like isn't going to affect that. We also, thankfully, have the experience of other countries like Scotland, like Australia, like Canada, who've moved to a no-fault system. What they have experienced is a short-term increase in the numbers. And I'm sure we will see that here because couples have been waiting. There was a decrease in the back end of last year as people anticipated the new law. But over time, I'm very confident from my experience and from the experience of other countries that will settle down. And we have to give people credit. They're grown-ups. They make their decisions very carefully. They do not decide to divorce lightly, and they won't do so going forward.
It does seem that this is a system that is moving towards a greater sense of individual responsibility, which is something that most governments profess to support. Why has it taken 50 years of campaigning to get to this point?
It has been a long time coming. So I've mentioned the resolution campaign, and we've been campaigning for over 30 years for this change. We nearly got there in the mid-90s. There was legislation on the books, but that got shelved. It didn't happen. And it's been a bit of a political hot potato, and I think it's not necessarily regarded as being a vote winner, something which, as you've said already, may be regarded as devaluing marriage. But actually, in recent years, what we particularly saw was the case 4 years ago of Mr. and Mrs. Owens, where Tinny Owens just wanted to get divorced. She took her case to the court. The court said, well, actually, you've not proven to our satisfaction that your husband has behaved so badly that the marriage has broken down. She ended up having to wait for 5 years of separation. And at that time, the Supreme Court, who looked at that case, our highest court in the land, said, well, we think this is a really unfortunate situation, but our hands are tied by what the law is. This is a matter for Parliament. And at that time, I spoke to journalists in Australia, in Canada. People were horrified around the world that in a civilised society, that was the situation that people found themselves in. So finally, the impetus was there, the support was there. People could see this wasn't about making divorce easy. It's absolutely not. It's about making it a kinder process. More than anything, there are about 250,000 children whose parents divorce every year. And for them, this is a really important development because an acrimonious separation invariably rubs off on children, whereas having this kinder process hopefully makes things just a little easier in terms of the conversation, sorting out child arrangements and indeed sorting out the money on divorce.
It does seem to be that particular example was extraordinary, pretty inhuman as it stands. Was that the most common example of something that happened, or is that sort of an outlier that just sort of bad legislation occasionally throws out these peculiar outliers? What's the main sticking point of the previous system before today?
So under the previous system, I think it's fair to say that case was an outlier, but an important one and one that people needed to see to show the injustice which could be done. Typically what would happen was that people were agreed that there should be a divorce, but they were generally horrified when they discovered that if they hadn't been separated for at least 2 years, one of them had to point the finger at the other. And as I've said, that led to a lot of acrimony, a lot of tension, and really made things a lot more difficult than they needed to be. So it's a kinder process going forward that we expect to see.
Well, Jo Edwards, thank you so much for joining us in the studio to talk through that issue. A big moment, of course, for your campaign, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, moving on, the government has got itself into an almighty mess with flip-flopping over conversion therapy. Now their planned LGBTQ conference, Safe to Be Me, has been cancelled after dozens of organisations, over 100, refused to take part. Well, Andrew Boff is chair of the London Assembly and committee and patron of LGBT+ Conservatives, and he joins me now. Welcome to the programme, Andrew. I suppose, first of all, this is a really quite bizarre situation. This was a manifesto commitment for the Conservative Party to hold this global conference. I understand that members of the royal family were involved, getting particularly Commonwealth countries on board, in many of which it is illegal to be gay, trying to bring that sense of global Britain and foster that attitude. And that's all been thrown away over a row over conversion therapy.
Yeah, this is enormous reputational damage for the government. It's difficult to overstate how important this conference was going to be. It was meant to be an indication of how Britain is taking the lead in standing up for rights of LGBT people around the world. British civil servants for the past year and a half have been travelling around the world promoting it, booking people into slots, making speeches to the conference to make some kind of global impact upon the situation of LGBT people. And this cancellation has made us look in the same kind of category as Poland with their backsliding on LGBT rights. It's an enormous disappointment that this has happened over an issue that could have been resolved very, very quickly if they'd have come to their senses.
And of course, the United Kingdom stepping into its new role, as the government has often said, of global Britain, had a particular role to play here in many parts of the world, particularly parts of the world, frankly, that Britain had been involved in over the previous 2 centuries. They're incredibly oppressive towards LGBT people. Could this conference have really made a difference in places like sub-Saharan Africa, in places like Sri Lanka?
I think it really would have made a difference, because it would have then given the world the ability to speak as one voice to those countries who are still reticent about granting the full range of rights to LGBT people. It would have made it. It would have shown that this is the next step in ensuring that human rights are extended to their entire populations. It would have made a difference, and that's why it's even more depressing that they've decided to cancel this conference because of the mess they've got themselves into, and they've got to do a bit of navel gazing now as to how they got themselves into this mess in the first place. There's a lot, This conference also, we had some problems, let's face it, over Brexit, over what countries were saying to us about us as cutting ourselves off from the rest of the world, when actually we are a global Britain. We want to be a global Britain. This was a part of the process of saying we have a global reputation which we're going to use. I went to a conference only 2 weeks ago in Rome, and the main purpose of that conference was to promote the Safe to Be Me conference in London. All that work to improve the reputation of the UK has just been thrown away. It saddens me enormously.
Now, the government says that it does want to deal with this issue of transgender conversion therapy, but in a separate way, in a potentially slightly more limited way than LGB conversion therapy. There was the most almighty mess last week, a full U-turn and then a half U-turn on top of that. Does the government know its own mind on these issues?
Well, it really doesn't, and the rights of LGBT people, of gay and lesbian people, are inextricably attached to the rights as well of trans people. We get the same discrimination. We have the same obstacles, and for them to, in some way, what they're basically saying is that it's okay to torture trans people, because this is what some of these conversion therapies are. They are torture. Now, I was astonished to start off with when it said that it was going to abandon its plans to make conversion therapy illegal, torture illegal, and then to say, oh, well, we can torture one group of people, but we can't torture another. That's fundamentally what this is about. And it's outrageous that trans people will not have the same protections as everybody else against having themselves tortured by people who just want to pray the gay away.
Well, Andrew Boff, it's an incredibly powerful statement you've made there. No wonder this has been an incredibly heated moment, and it is an incredible tragedy that this conference seems to have fallen away. Well, Andrew Boff, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. I'm afraid that's it for the programme. We're back again at 12 tomorrow. Up next, Liam Halligan is here with On the Money, but for now, it's the weather.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. Bright spells for many today, but there will be a lot of heavy showers around and some more persistent wet weather affecting the far north of Scotland, in particular Orkney. That's where an occluded front is lingering through the rest of the day. Low pressure sitting out to the west of Scotland, bringing this blustery and unstable westerly airflow in. A spell of rain clearing the far southeast as we head into the afternoon, but further fairly heavy showers following, and these will be lively with hail and gusty winds associated with them. Otherwise, a mixture of bright spells and showers for many. There will be some sunny spells at times, but in the north of Scotland and for parts of western Scotland, some more persistent rain, especially Orkney, and it will feel cold in the Northern Isles, milder elsewhere, but an increasing wind through the day. In fact, that wind reaching gale force in the north of Scotland, and then those gales pushing into Northern Ireland and parts of the Irish Sea coast, with northwest England, North Wales seeing gusts of 60, perhaps more miles an hour.